Welcome, everybody, to episode 4 of Big Data, Big Issues. I'm your host, Sheldon Kreger, and you can find out more about me by finding my LinkedIn profile in the description of this conversation. Today, we're going to be introducing a fundamental concept in the study of big data from a sociological perspective, which is surveillance capitalism. And this will be a multi-part series focused around the work of a brilliant scholar named Shoshana Zuboff. We'll be following some notes that I took while reading Shoshana Zuboff's 2019 masterpiece titled The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. Zuboff, the reason we'll be covering this topic in such detail is because it is a truly groundbreaking area of research, and it really provides the foundation from which we can view other issues in big data from just a clearer perspective. A little bit about Zuboff to begin. She earned her PhD in social psychology from Harvard, and she studied, at least briefly, she mentions in the book, under B.F. Skinner, who's a very famous psychologist and social psychologist who was highly interested in manipulating individual behavior and in how widespread manipulation of behavior could be used to create a better society. And actually, she mentions in the book that some of her, she has memories in grad school of arguing with Skinner in class quite frequently, and how this was highly influential on her thinking early on. In 1981, she became the Charles Edward Wilson Professor of Business Administration and one of the first tenured women on the Harvard Business School faculty. The book itself, as I mentioned, it's truly a masterpiece. I would recommend picking it up. You can find it wherever you purchase books, or I personally also listen to it on Audible. So I have a hard copy and I have a copy that I can listen to because it's quite lengthy. The book comes in over 700 pages, and it represents over a decade of work by Zuboff, where she traveled the country and interviewed top scholars in the field, but also top data scientists, business executives, chiefs of technology operations at major corporations around the country, as well as startups and venture capital firms, to gain perspective on their ideology and their worldview, and substantiated this alongside her knowledge of social psychology and many other social issues today. And so it is truly a groundbreaking work, and I highly recommend that you pick this book up. I believe that Zuboff's, the fundamental core of Zuboff's argument can be summarized in a quote that I found on page 233, which is, "We worry about companies that amass our personal data, and we wonder why they should profit. Who owns the data, we ask. But every discussion of data protection or data ownership omits the most important question of all. Why is our experience rendered as behavioral data in the first place?" Let's begin this conversation upon thinking about that quote. Let's continue forward by looking at surveillance capitalism in a more strict definition of the term. First of all, technological developments are, in a very recent history, say the last 15 to 20 years, have opened the doors to unprecedented amounts of surveillance. And I think culturally we're conditioned to think of the term surveillance as something that comes from the government in order to fight crime or to fight terrorism, or to, from a more negative perspective, to control individuals or silence political dissidents. And I think culturally we've been conditioned to think of surveillance as something that comes from the state. However, Zuboff argues that it's actually corporate surveillance that is a large part of the risk today, and is actually corporations do much more surveillance with a much more level of detail and with much less regulation, especially in the United States, than the government is able to do. And technological developments such as big data, data warehousing, and the affordability of hard drives and processing power, as well as the ease of performing analysis through open source technologies, and just the explosion of venture capital in the space has really opened the door to not just performing the surveillance, but also amassing behavioral data from consumers as people interact with corporate products. And then the corporations can use this data to later influence an individual's behavior. And Zuboff will go on to argue that it's not just individual manipulation that's of interest, but a more collective societal changes that are on the agenda at the highest levels of these corporations. So, for example, well, before we get to the example, let's define a very important piece of terminology that's at the core of Zuboff's book, which is instrumentarianism. And this is the process that I was describing earlier. The instrumentation and instrumentalization of behavior for the purpose of modification, prediction, monetization, and control. And this is defined on page 352 of the book, but also mentioned in the introduction. And this is the process of collecting data and then using this to make predictions and later manipulate individuals into taking specific actions. There are actually three instrumentarian techniques that Zuboff outlines in chapter 10 of the book. So these are the ways in which a corporation or whatever entity is performing surveillance and then sending some kind of feedback to a person. How do they influence personal behavior based on profiling from behavioral data? This is done, the first way is through tuning, which is the cueing or nudging of a user to follow a series of actions at a precise time and place. The second way is herding, which is controlling key aspects of a person's immediate context and therefore forcing them to take a specific action. And finally, there's conditioning, which was a key concept coming from B.F. Skinner, which is providing environmental conditions and reinforcements for specific sequences of behavior, which allows individuals to be modified to perform specific routines, and their perception is that this is voluntary. So to make this a bit more concrete, we're going to look at an example, which is if you imagine whatever app you use on your phone for map technology. Tuning in this scenario would be delivering an ad when a person walks in your Starbucks. So carry your phone around. You consent to have your geo information data published to the corporation that owns the app, usually alongside of some personally identifiable information like your name, the ID of your device, and so on. And this allows the company to build a personal profile of where you go and when you go there, as well as other devices or people that you interact with, and to gain a sense of where you are at specific points in time throughout the day. And then they can use this information to tune you to partake some particular action. For example, if you walk near a Starbucks, you might get a notification. I'm not saying this necessarily happens, but you may walk near a Starbucks or some other kind of business and get a notification on your phone that there's a sale or some other incentive to draw you into that store when you otherwise would not have done so. Herding, on the other hand, is a much more direct way to influence a person's behavior. And this involves redirecting a user through a specific route to avoid traffic in our map example. So giving the user some information or otherwise controlling them so that they are forced to do something that they wouldn't normally do. So in this situation, I may have in my mind when I get off work the fastest way to get home, but when I look at my map application, I might be herded to take a different route to avoid traffic. And finally, there could be conditioning, which is an example in the map context of conditioning would be to send me a traffic notification every day around 2 or 3 o'clock telling me that traffic is going to pick up and I need to leave now to get home at a specific time. And this is over time, this is going to give me some kind of incentive and maybe give me the opportunity to change my behavior so that I can leave earlier in the day, and so that collectively we all have less traffic on the road. And what's important is that instrumentarianism, it may have noble goals. For example, reducing traffic on the road. In the map context, getting traffic off the road, getting people from point A to point B in a safe and fast way, or even, giving somebody the opportunity to get a good deal on their favorite beverage at Starbucks or whatever. All of these things don't necessarily have to be evil in intent. But Zuboff argues that there's still many social ramifications for having this technology deployed, especially at such a large scale. And speaking of scale, for those of you who are not tuning in on YouTube, on the slide, I'm actually showing a graph of Google ad revenue from 2001 to 2018. And in 2018, the Google ad revenue totaled, oh wow, my Google phone's actually trying to do a search for me right now. Apologies for that. But the ad revenue has exceeded $116,320 million in 2018 compared to $95 billion the year before. And if we go back to 2001, just maybe $700 million, if I'm reading this chart correctly. And so what we can see is that there's a very, very rapid growth, just using Google as an example, over the way that surveillance technology allows a company to grow and expand into more and more aspects of our lives and to profit insanely in that process. Another quote from Zuboff in regard to this instrumentarian system is that another important point is that this is very unprecedented. And that capitalism, although it has historically, other scholars have studied capitalism and the problems and the pros and cons associated with it since the dawn of capitalism, Zuboff really argues that the rise of this instrumentarian influence and surveillance capitalism marks a departure from the capitalism of the past into a new form of capitalism in the future that has fundamentally much more power. And I quote from the book, "The unprecedented nature of surveillance capitalism has enabled it to elude systematic contest because it cannot be adequately grasped with our existing concepts. We rely on categories such as monopoly or privacy to contest surveillance capitalist practices. And although these issues are vital, the existing categories nevertheless fall short in identifying and contesting the most crucial and unprecedented facts of this new regime." And that's just a beautiful quote from the introduction of the book. One of the, I think, potentially controversial things that Zuboff does in this book is makes a very direct comparison between instrumentarianism and totalitarianism. But she does draw some key distinctions but the argument is that the similarity of instrumentarianism and totalitarianism is that they are unprecedented forms of power that had not been experienced in the past, and that rapidly had a tremendous amount of influence and really captured the minds and really captured the minds of the people, and had captured just a tremendous amount of power in a short period of time. And that we should view instrumentarianism, the rise of instrumentarianism, in just the same amount of seriousness as we did totalitarianism, or as we do historically looking back on totalitarianism, and that the rise of instrumentarianism is an equally significant historical event. But there are some key differences. The major thing being that totalitarianism was bent on the reconstruction of the human species through the dual mechanism of genocide and the engineering of the soul. And so, in contrast, instrumentarianism, the surveillance capitalists have no interest in murder or the reformation of our souls. Although their aims are in many ways just as ambitious as those of totalitarian leaders, they're also utterly distinct. And that's another quote from Zuboff early on in the book. So the primary difference here is that totalitarianism involved the manipulation of people's ideologies through explicit, often physical control of these people, including violence, and really forcing people to do things against their will, or alternatively, creating some kind of propaganda system to win people over to the cause, often by identifying enemies and unifying people around attacking those enemies, and so on. Whereas within instrumentarianism, because the primary goal, at least early on, has been the development of increased revenues and of profit, there's actually no need for violence in order to implement this kind of power. However, that doesn't mean that this is insignificant. And one of the things that Zuboff points out in the book that I believe is very important is that surveillance capitalism, fundamentally through its algorithmic precision, and it judges people through a lens of radical indifference. And this is a process in which there's an elimination of cultural categories like race and religion and gender in favor of mathematically precise categories. And this is all generated, these categories are based on personal profiling using behavioral data that come from specific individuals and from everybody collectively. And then they're gathered together using large software systems and advanced mathematical techniques in order to identify how people are similar in their behavior and how people are different in their behavior, and then be able to target media, target advertisements, and so on to those different categories of individuals in order to create profit and to create other forms of power argued by Zuboff. And I know it may sound conspiratorial, but Zuboff does present a fair amount of objective evidence of a more broad agenda on behalf of what she calls the Instrumentarian Collective, which is the title of one of the chapters of the book, where Zuboff argues that by quoting a number of scholars and drawing upon the conversations that she had in the research process for this book in the decade leading up to its publication, she provides a pretty substantial amount of evidence, not that these individuals have some kind of nefarious plan to take over the world, but rather they believe that this kind of technology provides a path forward for humanity to become more efficient and more peaceful, and to be basically to transition towards some kind of like techno utopia. And she doesn't get into the details of what that utopia looks like in the mind of these individuals, although you might refer to the book Walden 2 by B.F. Skinner, also an interesting read in this context. Going off on a tangent here. It's a really interesting book because it gives an example. Well, it provides a fictional account of a professor who builds a utopian society where the actions of the individuals are sort of defined and kind of allowed to unfold using objective analysis of, what they're good at, and using objective analysis of social behavior, and a whole new society is kind of formed in this lab experiment from this professor. And Zuboff kind of argues that this model presented by B.F. Skinner has a lot of similarities with the ideology, the direction that instrumentarianism is taking us towards this supposed technical utopia. And one of the key characteristics, coming back to radical indifference, is that there's elimination of many of the social constructs and cultural categories that we have today, and those are replaced in favor of mathematically calculated categories. And what she says in the book is actually has a quote from a gentleman named Pentland, who I'm not going to dive into a lot who he is right now, but he's a highly influential scholar coming out of MIT who works a lot with many of these instrumentarian organizations and has a lot of published research. But Zuboff quotes Pentland in the book saying that the goal is to create behavior patterns which produce behavior subgroups and a new behavior demographics that can predict disease, financial risk, consumer preferences, and political views, with between 5 and 10 times the accuracy of the standard measures. And this is just a quote from one of his papers, this guy Pentland, who I'm sure we'll be coming back to at some point. And it's, to me personally, stepping away from just kind of presenting what Zuboff says in the book and doing a bit of my own analysis here. It's really interesting to read some of Pentland's papers. I did take the time to do that and see the perspective of Pentland and the emphasis on the positive outcomes of using this kind of mathematical precision, modifying people's behavior, and the way that this can create a more efficient society. There's a lot of emphasis from these scholars on enhancing the efficiency of capitalism and minimizing the inefficiencies of capitalism. For example, if you have the more specific data that you have on an individual's health and their behaviors, such as what they eat, how much exercise they get, their genetic data, their family history, detailed information in their medical records, maybe some data about doctors they've worked with in the past or insurance claims that they filed. The idea is that you can conglomerate all of that data together and assign that person a doctor who's going to serve them and better than anybody else in the region, where this person can work, or maybe that this person can visit, or that they can use this data to identify individuals who have had similar histories or similar genetics and so on, and be able to say, okay, this person is at risk of getting cancer or of catching the flu, and being able to stop that before it happens. And so it's really important to understand that Pentland and a lot of the instrumentarian scholars and the agenda that is being pushed here is they believe that this is very much a noble goal. In contrast, Zuboff goes on to argue, and we'll dive into this in another episode, but Zuboff really goes on to argue that the price for this is just too high because it poses a fundamental threat to democracy and to individual agency. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up the conversation about surveillance capitalism part 1 right here. Again, I'm your host, Sheldon Kreger. You can find out more about me by checking out my LinkedIn profile. There's a link in the description of this conversation, wherever you happen to be finding that. And if you're interested in having me on your show or inviting me to a meetup or giving some kind of presentation, very much interested in doing that or connecting professionally, please let me know. And with that, I hope everyone has an awesome day. The best way to support this podcast is to like and leave comments, as well as share the episode with your friends and colleagues. You can find detailed notes, reading suggestions, and a complete episode list at bigdatabigissues.com.